Hello, everyone. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you all to today's session of Rethinking History, returning to archives and documents, featuring Professor Robert Travers of Cornell University, who will be speaking on Persian archives for histories of colonial state formation in South Asia in the 18th century. Professor Travers, thank you for accepting our invitation and joining us here today. Rethinking History, a virtual seminar series co-convened with my exceptional colleague, Professor Arzu Azad of Oxford University and Nalco, Paris, is a collaborative project of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto and the Invisible East and the Department of Continuing Education at Oxford. At the outset, and before introducing our speaker, I would like to express our personal and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Arzu Azad, will introduce our speaker. Professor Azad.
Thank you so much. Well, it gives me a great pleasure, and it's an honor to introduce our speaker today. Professor Robert Travers is Professor of History at Cornell University. He's the author of 2 books about colonial state formation in Eastern India in the late 18th century. Ideology and Empire in 18th Century India, the British and Bengal, published with Cambridge University Press in 2007. And the second book, Empires of Complaints, Mughal Law and the Making of British India, 1765 to 1793, also with Cambridge, 2 years ago, came out in 2023, which also received an honorable mention for the James Willard Hurst Prize from the Law and Society Association. He's a recent recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the School of Historical Studies at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, and is currently working on a new book about the impeachment of Warren Hastings. So without further ado, I'm very happy to pass the word on to Professor Travers. Please unmute yourself and share your PowerPoint slide if you have one.
Thank you so much. Yes, my PowerPoint. Let me find my PowerPoint. And
perfect. Yep.
Begin. Okay. Is that good? You can see the first slide?
Awesome.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, first of all, it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today in Zumistan, and I really want to thank Professor Tavakkoli Taghi and Professor Azad very much for inviting me, and Bilal Hashmi as well for his assistance in organizing the talk. And of course, thank you all for coming. I have to say I'm a little intimidated by this crowd. I have to beg your forgiveness for my pronunciation of Persian terms in the talk in advance. And I'm going to exploit the opportunity to ask for your help towards the end of the talk in deciphering some Persian texts that I'm currently failing to decipher. But I want to start today with a slide that is meant to highlight the efflorescence of new scholarship on Persian sources for the history of British colonialism in India in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I assembled this list quite quickly, including just a few recent books and articles from the many I might have chosen to give a sense of this growing field. The articles on the left give a rough sense of the range of Persian sources for colonial era South Asia that have most interested historians, including histories, diaries, literary and philological works, and legal documents. Whereas for a long time, the emphasis among historians of colonial India was on the rapid supersession of Mughal Persian by English as the primary language of empire, historians have recently been re-examining the way that British conquerors established their empire in India as much by colonizing the imperial language of Persian as by sidelining it. New works are exploring how British rule transformed Persianate infrastructures of governance and Persian genres of writing, and how South Asian elites continued to engage with colonial rulers by reworking Persianate norms of political justice and reciprocal rulership. Is my volume all right? I do have a loud voice. Okay, good. This flourishing of new research on colonial era Indo-Persian texts represents quite a big shift of historical attention from when I was starting my doctoral research on early colonial India in Cambridge University in the mid-1990s. At that point, histories of the East India Company government of Bengal were still mostly based on English language sources, especially the massive archives of the India Office records in London. But as I began my research for what became the book Ideology and Empire, by reading the private papers of leading British officials in what was still treated as the Mughal Suba of Bengal, it was clear to me that these officials spent most of their time reading Persian administrative documents, as well as histories, treatises, poetry, and other genres of writing. After the company's conquests of Bengal, proficiency in Persian quickly became one of the main qualifications for political office in the company. Yet intellectual histories of British ideologies in India were almost exclusively centered on the exportation of European Enlightenment theories of politics and economics, rather than encounters with British and Indo-Persian political culture. One of the first pieces I read in graduate school that seemed to open up this Persian dimension of British Indian history was Professor Tavakkoli Targhi's famous essay from 1996 on Orientalism's Genesis Amnesia, which detailed William Jones's reliance on Persian scholarship for his philological investigations, a theme that has lately been taken up again by Rajiv Kinra. In a sense, my own historical research has tried to address the colonial state's Genesis amnesia about its reliance on late Mughal forms of statecraft, even as it disparaged Mughal governance as a degraded product of Oriental despotism. The Genesis amnesia of the British Empire in India about its Persianate entanglements depended on the long-term obfuscation of Persian sources and archives from the historical record. That this archival silencing lasted so long is a testament to the enduring power of colonial civilizational narratives that relegated Persian as a supposedly archaic language to the so-called Muslim period of Indian history. The neglect of Persian sources for colonial state building was in part, of course, a product of imperial archiving practices that collated a huge volume of English language proceedings in the imperial metropolis in London. English-centered archives relegated Persian records either to non-official collections of private papers, where they were often never properly catalogued, or to district record offices, where many of them were left to rot. It was also, of course, a product of the decline of Persian literacy in modern India and in modern Britain, where much of the historiography of the company state continued to be carried on. Just as a side note, one of the greatest scholars of early British rule in India, Professor P.J. Marshall, an important mentor for me, recently passed away aged 91. Peter told me last summer that after he had written his thesis in Oxford in the late 1950s on the impeachment of Warren Hastings, his advisor, Dame Lucy Sutherland, had suggested that the next step for him would be to learn Persian, extremely forward-thinking of her in the late 1950s. Peter expressed some regret that almost straight away he took up a job teaching British history at King's College London, and his plans to study Persian fell away. As regards the study of colonial-era Persian in Britain, a real unheralded pioneer was John Gurney, the retired university lecturer in Persian at Oxford. Gurney's brilliant 1968 Oxford PhD, The Depths of the Nawab of Arcot, has sadly never been published, but it remained up to the 1990s one of the few works of British imperial history that referenced Persian sources, in this case histories and letters produced in the Arcot court. Early in my career, someone in the UK told me that the problem with British Indian history was that every time a British scholar did learn Persian, they immediately fell in love with Persian poetry and abandoned the field of imperial history. A Forsterian passage to Indo-Persian poetry that I'm still hoping one day I may take. By the time I started my doctoral research, I had the good luck to read a new generation of Bengali scholars who read Persian, notably Kumkum Chatterjee on the Persianization of political culture in Bengal. Michael Fisher, trained in Persian in Chicago, had done important research on the history of the office of Akhbar Navis, or newswriter, in the transition to British rule. Fritz Lehmann, who studied at Wisconsin and in Patna, and later taught at UBC, had written a deeply researched, again unpublished, PhD on Persian historians in Bihar in the 18th century. But to join this small but intrepid band of Persian reading scholars of colonial India seemed to me, when I started in 1995 in Cambridge, a desirable but remote prospect. In the 3 or 4 years of a British PhD in history, there was scarcely the time, let alone the infrastructure, for serious language study. And while I learned some Persian in Cambridge with the generous help of John Cooper and Charles Melville, my first book was based almost wholly on English sources. I should say, especially given that some of you are in Oxford, that as I was struggling to learn Persian as a graduate student, a crucial inspiration came from Polly O'Hanlon, who was taking Persian lessons in Delhi while I was doing my research in 1997 and beginning to publish her brilliant work on gender at the Mughal court. I was very fortunate that my career as a history professor in the US eventually gave me the time and the resources to commit to studying Persian properly, especially after I moved to Cornell in 2005 and enrolled in Yago Gochelashvili's Persian class here. By the time I began work on Persian sources, I had also the benefit of learning from the dramatic expansion of English language historiography of the Mughal world and of the wider Persianate world in the early 2000s. The historical image of the Mughal Empire was being transformed from earlier portrayals of a medieval feudal system of agrarian empire to a hub of early modern connected histories, cross-cultural interactions, and Persianate state building. My 2023 book, Empires of Complaints, Mughal Law and the Making of British India, therefore tried to resituate the East India Company's imperialism in Bengal in its late Mughal Persianate context. I argued here that the company consolidated its rule after its military conquests by insinuating its own power into a dynamic Persianate infrastructure of late Mughal governance. I foregrounded tense encounters between British rulers and Indian petitioners who made claims to land and its surplus based on late Mughal forms of entitlement, often using Persian document forms. The East India Company's colonization of late Mughal judicial tribunals eventually produced, I argued, a new colonial version of Mughal imperial law as the legal grounding of British rule. In line with the focus of this series on archives, I've selected for today a series of documents for discussion that reconstruct my own tentative forays into the Persian archives for colonial state formation. I want to emphasize that because of my own latecomer limitations as a reader of Persian, I've only really just begun to scratch the surface of what is quite a large, mostly still untapped, and also quite a scattered archive. My entry point into the late Mughal world of petitioning subjects in Bengal came through this series of English records preserved in the West Bengal State Archives in Kolkata. Unusually for company proceedings in the 1770s, these volumes, kept by a British official known as the Superintendent of the Khalsa Records, were not copied and shipped back to London. This, I suspect, was because the Khalsa Superintendent was a subordinate officer under the Governor General and Council, and his reports were therefore represented in the Supreme Council proceedings that were sent home. But reading the daily records of the Khalsa in Calcutta in 2008-9 gave a strikingly different view of early British Indian politics, not as a conversation between British elites on the Governor's Council, but as a series of strained encounters between British officials and a great crowd of Indian officials and petitioners. The Khalsa was formerly the Khalisa Sharifa, or Main Revenue Office in the old Mughal capital at Murshidabad, which had been relocated to the company's capital in 1772. And huge numbers of documents, but also large numbers of officials moved down the river from Murshidabad to Calcutta in 1772. The Khalsa proceedings offered a view from the clamorous Kachari, or public record office, not from the closed world of the council chamber. These records helped me then, at least dimly, to see through the English archive of colonial state building into a mostly lost archive of Persian language petitions, revenue deeds, contracts, and local accounts of tax collections kept in Persian and Bengali, and sometimes both, that were translated into English in the Khalsa records. These official document forms included sanads, parwanas, kabuliyats, kabalas, ikrarnamas, hibanamas, mahsarnamas, and many other kinds of legal documents on which late Mughal subjects staked their claims over land and its produce. A problem I had, apart from my painful slowness in reading Persian, was that relatively few of these lower-level documentary forms survived in the original language. The English archive, through a massive exercise in translation, seemed to have cannibalized its own documentary sources, rendering their Persianate forms mostly invisible. I was fortunate, however, that a company soldier, Charles Stewart, who later became a Persian teacher in England, published a manual for young British officials learning to read Persian in 1825. And this, surprisingly really, included printed versions of a series of petitions from the very early company period in Bengal in the 1770s. Stewart's chapter headings here give you a sense of the main genres of Persian writings which British officials needed to master, including Chapter 1, petitions, or arzis. Here, I want to zoom in on one of these petitions that takes us into the world of the early colonial Kachari through the pen of a Hindu Divan, one Basant Roy. In September 1776, Basant Roy delivered this arzi, or petition, to an English council in Calcutta about the failure of local revenue farmers, ijaradars, to send copies of their official accounts, called here Kagazat-e-Tafsil, to the company's Sadr, or central office. Without these local records, it was impossible for the Divan to adjudicate disputes, termed here munakashat, between taxpayers, riaya, and tax collectors. This text starts by declaring it was hamishe ma'mul, translated by Stewart as always customary for such papers to be sent. This phrase, hamishe ma'mul, raises an interpretive problem that came up very frequently in my research. When contemporaries wrote of old customs, did they mean under company rule, which had only in effect just begun in the early 1770s? Or also, did they refer to the period of Mughal government and the rule of the Nawabs of Bengal? To what extent could early colonial records such as this offer a retrospective window onto late Mughal practices of governance and law? While the term limit of ma'mul here remains unclear, and this text is no doubt a product of a particular moment of early colonial politics, I came to argue, based on my reading of the Khalsa records and other Persian sources, that the ideal or ethos of responsive government described here, in which copies of revenue records held at the center were supposed to be a check on local officials and a potential resource for petitioners, was a pervasive feature of Kachari politics in late Mughal as well as early colonial Bengal, shared by officials and petitioners alike. This was an ethos, as here, that often in practice broke down into knotty disputes over protocols of writing and interpretation of records that also themselves generated petitions to higher levels of authority. I came to think then that the records of the Khalsa, here's a translation of the that Stewart gives of the the Basant Roy petition. And you'll see he says these 7 petitions were presented to the Committee of Revenue in Calcutta in 1773, which when I read this was, made me think, gosh, these document forms were still considered relevant for British officials in the 1820s. So this gives you a sense of the durability of these forms, these documentary forms in British India. I came to think that the records from Bengal echoed what Nandini Chatterjee argued for the Mughal province of Malwa, in whose superb study from 2020, Negotiating Mughal Law. She had shown there that the Mughal revenue system gave rise to a distinctive Persianate form of imperial law. This was a hybrid legal regime, she argued, poised, you could say, between Sharia and Qanun, the law of jurists and the law of governors, dealing especially with disputes over land grants and revenue contracts. It drew on the legal expertise of qazis and muftis, decrees by Mughal governors, and official interpretations of local custom. Chatterjee suggested that the Persian term for this Mughal Islamic imperial law was dastur. In this contentious system of legal entitlement, Persian grants, title deeds, and decrees issued from government centers, as well as contracts and deeds attested by local qazis, generated a wide field of petitioning for imperially sanctioned rights, in which the clamorous crowds that I was reading about in Calcutta were an early colonial expression. Here then is an original sanad, or title deed, for a hereditary tax-paying ta'alluqdar, in effect a small zamindar, that issued from the Calcutta Khalsa in 1781. You see here, it was actually printed in Persian and Bengali, using the newly established presses in Calcutta that Miles Ogborn has written about in his book, Indian Ink. This second sanad, which seemed to be granted to the same individual, but 2 years later in 1783, was not printed. Perhaps the printer was off work that day, but it bears the signature of Warren Hastings, Governor General in Bengal. These sanads represented the ultimate prize sought by many claimants at the Calcutta Khalsa, government confirmation of a hereditary right to collect taxes from specified villages according to a set rate of collection. A prize for which rival candidates would often spend years of their lives in Calcutta petitioning and repetitioning government. These documents are also an example of the archival scattering that also befell Persian sources in early colonial Bengal. They seem to have arrived in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin via a British judge's private papers. And this might have something to do with Alois Sprenger, who was the Austrian head of Delhi College in the 1830s and 1840s and might have brought these up. I just don't know for sure. One of them had apparently been produced in a company court in 1786 to justify a land claim. And here I've blown up the seal of the Khalisa Sharifa, the official seal in Calcutta, bearing the name of Shah Alam II, the Padshah, as well as the Compagnie Angrezi. And then Khalisa Sharifa is written here at the bottom. Approaching colonial state building through the prism of the Khalsa records enabled me to revisit from a new angle one of the founding moments of colonial law in British India. Governor General Warren Hastings' famous judicial plan of 1772. This plan has usually been viewed as the origin point for a new colonial system of religiously defined personal laws in British India. Historians have argued that Hastings' scriptural view of Indian law set the stage for British translations of texts of Arabic and Sanskrit jurisprudence, fiqh and Dharma Shastra into reinvented colonial forms of, quote, Muslim and Hindu law. But when I looked again at the early records for Hastings' Sadr Diwani Adalat, or Chief Civil Court, in 1773, it became clear that Hastings understood that what he called Muslim and Gentoo law formed only part of a complex hybrid of judicial practices centered on the late Mughal revenue kachari. In this document from 1773, we see how Hastings ordered that 3 ijlases, or assemblies of legal experts should begin to form digests of legal norms for the, for the assistance of British judges. Not only Mulvis and Pandits for Fiqh and Dharmashastra, but also leading revenue officials of the Khalsa Sharifa, Diwans, Mutasaddis, and Kanungos, treated as experts on, quote, the laws and usages as immediately respect the business of revenue. Given that the revenues were the main business of government in this period, this covered a lot of legal ground. Another side note here, if I was starting my project again, I'd pay a lot more attention to the Kanungos, who seem to have been mostly recruited in Bengal from high-caste Hindu scribal groups, Kayasthas, and they're often treated in secondary literature as revenue accountants. They're often called registrars. But in late Mughal Bengal, I think, especially the higher level Kanungos in Murshidabad, seem also to have acted as something like the literal meaning of their office in Persian, as law sayers, sayers of the law, especially in relation to landed inheritance. I never found the compilation of Mughal revenue laws, the ijlas of revenue officials that was envisaged by Hastings here, although the records of judicial inquiries at the Khalsa revealed the gradual colonial sifting and reworking of ideas about Mughal law, in which Indian revenue officials and Kanungos played an important role as legal advisors. Thanks to the generosity of Nandini Chatterjee, however, I was able to read this Persian treatise written by leading Indian officials of the Khalsa in Calcutta, the Rai Rayan and Kanungos in 1775. This document, as you can see, was stored in the private papers of James Grant, a leading company official and expert Persianist, and it's held in the South Asia collections in the British Library. In this text, apparently commissioned by the British ruling council, the Khalsa officials described their retrospective view of practices of revenue collection and justice, adolat, under the rule of the Nawabs in the first half of the 18th century. Now, there are many fascinating aspects to this treatise, which I saw quite late in my research and was only able to discuss briefly in my book. The text details the complex intermeshing of fiscal and judicial governance in late Mughal Bengal, in which zamindar landholders regularly appealed to Mughal imperial authorities to resolve boundary disputes or disputes over tax collections and debts. According to this treatise, disputes over zamindari inheritance in late Mughal Khalsa Sharifa would be judged by the chief mutasaddi of the Khalsa, chief revenue official, drawing on the opinions of Islamic legal scholars in the case of Muslim zamindars and of Brahmin Pandits, called in the text the Ahli Shastar, the people of the Shastar, or Panditan in the case of Hindus. If this text can be believed, something like a Hindu form of inheritance law based on interpretations of Dharmashastra texts may thus have formed part of late Mughal judicial culture in Bengal, though this was just one element in a broader set of official customary norms around land disputes. The Persian text also invoked the concept here of Ra'ijul Mulk, which the British translated as Raj-ul-Mulk. It actually comes up in Edmund Burke's writings, Raj-ul-Mulk, spelled R-A-G-E, and it was translated as custom of the country by British officials. Later on, the more familiar term was Ravaj-ul-Mulk, but in this period, Ra'ij-ul-Mulk seemed to be the term for custom. I've magnified this paragraph of the treatise here, in which the Khalsa officials review the usual forms of law, Marawaj Shar, in the different Kachari adolats in Murshidabad under the Nawabs. Something interesting to note here, I think, is the use of the term millet for sect or religious community, a term more familiar to us from the Ottoman millet system. According to this account, the Muqtasadi of the Khalsa, was charged with making sure that disputes in relation to different millets, har millet, were decided according to their particular rules. And the term for rule here is ayin, which included ayin anha. It says har millet should have their cases decided according to ayin anha, including norms derived from Shastra and Dharma Shastra. Now, to continue the theme of archival scattering, after I finished my book, when I was writing it, I saw this treatise, and the treatise said it had been written for the council, but I couldn't find any records of this on the council business, so I couldn't tell if it had actually gone up to the council, the British council. But then, thanks to a tip-off from a Cornell colleague, Jessica Radcliffe, Jessica Radcliffe has a wonderful book on the East India Company's scientific collections. She helped me to discover this translation of the treatise in, of all places, the New York Public Library. I was very surprised to find this translation of a Persian document from Calcutta in New York, from the 1770s in New York. The translation had been in the private papers of one of the members of the ruling council, Philip Francis, and was later sold by a member of Francis's family to the New York Public Library in the early 20th century. Now, Philip Francis, as some of you will know, looms very large in the historiography of early British Bengal because of a treatise he wrote on the land tenures of Bengal in 1776, which formed the basis of a brilliant work of intellectual history by the great historian of Bengal, Ranajit Guha, in 1963, A Rule of Property for Bengal. Guha famously foregrounded the French physiocratic context for Francis's ideas about zamindar landed property, arguing that European ideas of property underpinned the company's revenue policies, especially after the permanent zamindari settlement of 1793. Guha's interpretation followed the Europe-centered grain of the British archives and tended to ignore or downplay the influence of Persian writings on Francis and his colleagues, and the way they grounded their theories of zamindari rights in British ideas about Mughal law, including the treatise that I've mentioned, which talks about, the inheritance of zamindari rights. By tracing histories of zamindari disputes in the Khalsa records in Calcutta, I suggested in my book that a new colonial rule of property emerged from tense, unequal judicial encounters between British officials, Indian officials, and Indian litigants. On a case-by-case basis, British rulers selectively but systematically modified late Mughal protocols for doing justice, trying to cut through endemic disputes over land rights, and I think to make zamindari rights more easily saleable, marketable. Seeking to tighten the state's grip over local agrarian resources and to unlock what was seen as untapped wealth in the land system, the company gradually worked to standardize, simplify, and recodify norms of hereditary succession as a way of reinforcing intermediary land rights as a saleable commodity. Through judicial decrees and by issuing new written regulations that were translated into Persian, the company eventually generalized a new system of forced sale for zamindari tenures for arrears of revenue, with money from the sale of land rights used to pay off debts to government. The company also used decrees in cases of zamindari debt to encourage Indian merchants and financiers to buy up zamindari rights and to lend money to local taxpayers, infusing wealth derived from coastal trades into the system of agrarian taxation. So in essence, I don't think Guha was wrong to argue that there was something very novel about the company's attempt to commodify zamindari rights, and to trace that novelty to European ideas about property. But what I also think is that the mechanism for doing this was through the categories of Mughal law, in which zamindari rights had already become, to some degree, marketable and mortgageable and justiciable within Mughal courts. Before I end today, I want to share a couple of Persian sources. I still have time, Bilal, is that right? I'm doing okay.
Yes,
okay.
you have plenty of
Great. Okay, this is good. This is where you come in and you tell me, you help me to read some difficult stuff. Before I end today, I want to share a couple of Persian sources from my new research into the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the British governor of Bengal, who was impeached in Parliament. It was one of the last impeachments in the British Parliament, lasted from 1788 to 1795, and it became a cause célèbre in British imperial history. These two portraits are from the National Portrait Gallery. The trial has usually been treated as an event in British parliamentary history, which of course it was, and as a venue for leading British politicians and men of letters, such as Edmund Burke and Richard Brinsley Sheridan, to subject the East India Company to enlightened European critiques of imperial corruption, critiques based on ideas of natural justice and universal rights. In my research, I'm trying to treat the trial as also a moment in global legal history, when the Islamic imperial law of the Mughal Empire was being expropriated and remade as the legal basis for the British Empire in India. In the printed minutes of evidence of the trial, produced by the House of Lords, which are quite formidable, and don't hold your breath for this book because I'm currently, drowning in these records. A massive project of translating Persian documents, including letters, petitions, and other legal documents into parliamentary forms of English, later, I think, obscured the role that Persian language sources played in this trial. Different sides in the trial mobilized Persian documents to justify their legal positions. In general terms, I want to explore how the impeachment of Warren Hastings grew out of the turbulent confluence of two early modern cultures of empire, Anglophone and Persianate, both of which acted as engines of critique, complaint, and legal disputation, fueled by the politics of imperial state building. Edmund Burke often argued that he was speaking up in Parliament on behalf of voiceless millions of Indians who could not travel to London to lodge their complaints in Parliament themselves. But throughout the trial, Burke and his colleagues also drew on petitions of Indian subjects who often framed their critiques of company government in Persianate terms, invoking established norms derived from Sharia, Dastur, Ayn, Ra'ijul Mulk, and Insaf, or Adalat, to hold British rulers, including Hastings, to account. Here is an interesting example of an Indian petition in Persian that traveled back to London and played into the politics of the Hastings trial. And if you're interested in this, I've written about it in an article that just recently was published in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. Nanda Kumar was a Brahmin politician in Bengal who became a determined enemy of Governor Hastings. Condemned on a charge of forgery by English judges of the Calcutta Supreme Court in 1775, Nanda Kumar wrote this petition to the English Governor General and Council soon before he was publicly executed by hanging. The petition was then burned by the common hangman in Calcutta as containing libelous allegations against Governor Hastings. But nonetheless, it was reported back to England, where it was later translated into the parliamentary proceedings and used by Hastings' opponents. The Persian text is a notable example, I think, of the repurposing of Mughal idioms of justice for a British audience. It begins by highlighting Nanda Kumar's high status under the Mughal Empire. In earlier times, he wrote, the Nazims of these provinces, because of this good character, gave me succor and support, and even from the threshold of the king of Hindustan himself, he, Nanda Kumar, was honored by a Mansab rank of 5,000. So he's invoking his Mughal credentials here at the beginning of the petition. As the text goes on, Nanda Kumar switches his primary allegiance and his hope for justice from the Padshai Hindustan, the Mughal emperor, to the Padshai Vilayat, King George III of England. He warns the council in Bengal that his execution, quote, will not hide the bad deeds of anyone from the justice of the king, Adalati Padshah. And in the case, he declared, a wonderful kind of phrase at the end of the petition, that I am unjustly killed. I will be hanging on the skirts of my persecutors on the day of judgment. I will be hanging on the skirts of my persecutors. And it says, Dar akibat damangir khahad shud. So given the way Nanda Kumar's death continued to echo as an exemplary act of colonial oppression, the petition was, I think, prophetic. If Warren Hastings was being assailed in such Persian petitions before he was put on trial in Parliament, he also made full use of his Persian skills and his large network of Indian allies to stage his own defense in the idioms of Mughal justice. During the trial, thousands of Indian signatories put their names to Persian testimonials testifying to Hastings' political virtue, styled as Mahzarnamas or Rajinamas, and they were circulated by Hastings' friends across North India. But the final Persian source I want to leave you with and quiz you about is in some ways among the more unlikely Persian texts from the era of the Hastings impeachment. It turns out that Warren Hastings did not just use Persian texts from India to defend himself. He also himself wrote Persian in the privacy of his personal diary, as he recorded the tumultuous events of the trial. And I'm going to give you some examples here from the diary of Hastings' brief Persian interludes, so you can see how he slipped kind of in and out of Persian as he was writing his diary. So this is a nice one. This is on in April 1786, before the trial. Lord Mansfield, who was the chief, he was the Lord Chancellor, called in the morning. So Hastings has serious lawyers on his side. Arzi mi farmayad. He orders the petition. And in fact, Hastings presented a petition to be allowed to defend himself to Parliament that week. The next one, you'll be amused that I spent a long time looking up this word in Steingaus's dictionary before I realized it was referring to Henry Dundas, the British politician. In this passage, Hastings discusses a kind of crucial moment where William Pitt, the younger, turned against him. Hastings never thought the trial would be brought. He and his friends thought that Pitt wouldn't allow it to be brought. But Pitt votes for the trial at a crucial point. And here Hastings says P's motive for the late opposition. And this is a very enigmatic little bit of Persian, which I can't really tell what, I mean, I can probably tell the words. It looks like Huzur, probably the king, the presence, Dundas, and then Chur, which probably is the Chancellor, I'm guessing, Lord Chancellor. So those three words, I mean, even Peter Marshall couldn't tell me, what that meant. So I probably have no chance of guessing. This one is even more mysterious. I can't tell what these Persian words are. It refers to a goftugu, or a discussion between Pitt and the king and I think Dundas. And Hastings claimed, this is in 1787, Hastings claims that Dundas and the Chancellor want, and maybe the king as well, want Pitt to end the impeachment and, somehow shut it down. But Pitt refuses. And this word, could it be Javadar, like Javadar, meaning like, Steingaus translated as liberal person or something like that, Kiast, Um, I can't anyway. I can't make this out. So in the Q&A afterwards, any tips about this? There's some kind of goftogu going on between high-level officials in England, and Hastings is recording it in Persian. Just to give you a longer sense, this is. I just need to move that a little bit. Sheridan, Hamrai, Shahzada, so going with the Shahzada, the prince, Dar Khonesh, to his house. There probably should be an aleph in there. Nick Abbott, my friend Nick Abbott, was saying that Hastings kind of makes funny little mistakes. Maybe he meant to have an H in there as well, Hamrai, as a companion. Dar Bagshot. Bagshot is the house where the prince currently lived in by the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Edward, Bagshot House. Karibe Hafte Ruz Gozasht. So almost a week, I think he means to say there. Maybe he meant to say Haft Ruz, I don't know, 7 days, but he says almost a week. And let me just give you one more. This is a nice one. This was when, this was the madness of King George. King George had gone mad. And there's a lot of discussion of, the king's illness. And here we have Farda, Queen Charlotte. Queen Radid, the queen saw him, and Se Dochtar, 3 daughters. So he goes, you can see, in and out of Persian here. Perhaps Persian came for Hastings. I'm going to go back to this one just so that if any of you get it, I can leave it up there for you. Perhaps Persian behaved for Hastings a kind of cipher to keep secret gossip and information in his diary from other members of his household. But as I read through the diary, I was struck by how often Hastings reverted to Persian at moments of particular stress or in describing the machinations of his opponents. It seems to me now that for this Persianate Englishman, who had spent most of his life in late Mughal Bengal, Persian had become not just a formal public language of empire, but it also demarcated a personal language of private reflection that worked unconsciously in his diary to translate his enemies in the alien and often hostile world of English politics into his Anglo-Indian comfort zone of Persian. Perhaps it is not so surprising that Hastings' sense of self would have become so attached to his life in India as a Persian-trained administrator. The apparent incongruity of Hastings' use of Persian in his private diary is itself, I suppose, a product of the civilizational boundary work performed by European colonialism's later sense of itself as the exclusive progenitor of global modernity. Warren Hastings came to be historicized in British imperial history as an exporter to India of advanced forms of British knowledge, rather than an importer of Persianate forms of knowledge and political ideas into British politics. In remembering British India's Persianate genesis amnesia, then, we are also rediscovering an imperial contact zone in which political languages were bleeding constantly into one another, and remaking political thought in imperial Britain as well as in British Bengal. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. It was amazing. Lots to think about, many accolades, many people clapping for you.
Shall I stop sharing? Would that be a good thing to do?
Yeah, maybe then we can see your wonderful self, as fascinating as these documents are to look at.
Yeah, let me just go back to Zoom, stop share. Okay, great.
So while people gather up their thoughts, please send us your questions or raise your hands, and I will call on you. I might start with the first observation. This final point about the code switching between the different languages and scripts reminds me a little bit of the Judeo-Persian documents that we study from Afghanistan in the 11th and 12th century in Afghanistan. And you see within the same line, just like here, there's the switching between Hebrew script and Arabic script, though in the same language of Persian. But it sort of reminds me that somehow, people like Hastings and like our Jews in medieval Afghanistan might have been embracing these different cultures at the same time, and sort of in the notes, the Judeo-Persian notes that we have are also private commercial notes. So it's really in the personal space where people can actually live out, the multiple cultures that they live. So I thought that was really, really nice to see. But I also agree with you that the cipher might also be sort of hairy stuff that he thought, if this gets into the wrong hands, I have my code. And the third thing I saw, there were quite a lot of errors in the Persian, but they are actually basically transcriptions of the Persian he heard. So it also shows us that he probably learned to write Persian in a phonetic way, which is sort of how people like me, who never lived in the Persian speaking world, I grew up in Germany, but that's how I learned to write Persian too, just from listening to it. So really, really fascinating material. And I'm curious to hear from you about your future book on Warren Hastings, and are you going to bring in these documents? I guess you are, but in what way? And also, do you look at the documents in the flesh, so to speak? I mean, I know you saw the one in the public library, but do you also look at the sort of materiality of these documents and their travel and their history as living objects, if you want, or living artifacts?
Yes, thanks for that question. I'm also curious about my next book because I'm thinking it through at the moment, so I don't have a very complete answer to your question. But I am interested in, as much as I can be, in the physical form of the documents, particularly these razinamas that he got signed. And there is one in the British Library, preserved in the British Library, which comes as a long scroll. With Persian at the top, but also Sanskrit, and I think also Bengali, and then all the signatures. And I think the Persian may have been written by Ali Ibrahim Khan, who was a leading administrator in that Hastings appointed to the chief magistrate of Benares. And so I'm very interested in those testimonials. Peter Marshall wrote about how they were in some ways the most successful element of Hastings' defense. They enabled him to argue that, South Asian elites didn't think he was an oppressor, so why should Burke think he was an oppressor? And so they were quite a public relations coup, and they were printed in English. I'm very interested in the way they were staged in English, using a kind of Persian-y English, using a kind of Orientalized English, in a rather kind of hammy way. So I'm interested in both the role of the physical objects, but also the translation practices that kind of, foreignize them in a certain way, really in order to emphasize, the apparent, what they presented was apparently a kind of empire of consent, very different than Burke's view of this as an oppressive military conquest. So that's one element. But there are also petitions from Rangpur. There was a major, so those were rather elite documents, but there were also kind of more lowly petitioning in a rural rebellion in Rangpur, when local landholders petitioned against oppressive tax collections, and those also made it into Burke's speeches. So I'm interested in following these different lines of transmission of these, Indian Arzis, if that makes sense. But any advice you can offer about those things, gratefully received, because it's very much in the early stages.
It's so fascinating. And maybe one more thing, you might not know is that we had a workshop with Nandini and her team when she still had her European Research Council grant, as did we, and we compared some of the documents that she has on her website that they have digitized.
Yeah, the law forms. Yeah.
Yes, the law firms with ours from medieval Afghanistan, and it reminded what we came to realize is what you also found, what you mentioned earlier, where the Sharia and the Shastra sort of rules are sort of mixed and matched to suit the imperial needs, or is it the zamindari needs? I forget. The imperial needs, I think, in response to the zamindari's petitions.
Yes.
And we find exactly the same in the medieval period as we did in Nandini's. So I think this is an interesting lesson in, people who treat the Sharia almost as a sort of, unchangeable sort of body of law, as if it sort of was then plonked onto different communities, but it's actually not. It's very dynamic, and it's adapted and adjusted to the needs on the ground, so to speak. So this is yet another example that I wasn't aware of. So I really thank you for that. And I think unless you want to comment, would you like to comment on that? No. So then I think
thank you.
Thank you. We've got some questions. So we've got, sorry, let me just see. Raised hand from Razak Khan, I think came first. So please, Razak Khan, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you for this opportunity. Am I audible?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Travers. I have so many questions, but I'll try to limit them to two. One is a historiographical shift that you started with on your first slide about the new work. And I'd love to hear your thought in my mind, that shift I associate with the remarkable work of Kumkum Chatterjee, whom you mentioned, which is an idea of thinking of Persianization as a process, at least in early modern years, not through the imperial Mughal court, but through other non-Mughal, and I may add non-Muslim courts, so Bengal, of course, but also I'm thinking of Prachi Deshpande's work on Maharashtra and Nandita Prasad Sai's work on Marwar. So my question there is, would you say that there is a possibility to move beyond this idea of the Persian and the Islamicate to this other idea of thinking of Persianization or Persian as a documentary language? And there, my sense is that it is largely seen as a legal terrain, and it's largely gone in legal history perspective. But would you also be open to thinking of other modes of thinking about Persian as the language of document, land document, for example, is one terrain. So just wanted to ask you about the historiographical movement from Persian and legal history to a much more wider, capacious movement. That's one. The second, I was wondering, in the case of Warren Hastings, because I have an interest, given my previous work on Rampur, do you see any encounter in the Warren Hastings archive also about Persian and linguistic and cultural complexity within dealing with the Rohingyas, Afghans in this area? So is there a traffic between Pashto or Persian that's been talked about? Is there an attention to Shia Sunni differences of court formation within the Mughal Awadh and the Rohilla polities? If you could say something on
Thank
that.
you. Thank you for those questions. I agree absolutely with the spirit of your first questions in terms of thinking of a kind of broad trajectories of Persianization in relation. Oh, a bird just bumped against my window. Broad trajectories of Persianization as a documentary language. And I think what's striking about the Adalats, the company's law courts, was how it was just assumed that any Adalat would keep its records in Persian. It was just assumed, even though many of some of the documents that were being produced, especially the revenue accounts, especially I think on the revenue side, they were in Bangla. but it was just assumed to have an adolat, you would have your ruznama, your daily record in Persian. And even one of the things that fascinated me is even the English court in Calcutta, the Supreme Court, it issued its decrees. It was an English court governing according to English law, but when it issued its decrees, it had them. It was in English and Persian, and I think that's because Persian was just the language of legal authority, and it had to, if you were going to have a court, you had to have Persian. So I think that's crucial to think about. The point that you make is very well taken. Then that if this is a language of law, then it's not in some sense only an Islamic or certainly not only an Islamic language. There's a very interesting essay by Sumit Guha last year, which I only just read in comparative studies, where he tries to kind of say, no, Persian really was a language of conquest, and it was, as far as I read him, but I think it was a language of law, is what I see in Bengal, and a language of law for everybody. The Rohilla question, I'll have to, pass on because I can't really answer that, but I'm hoping that some of my work on the trial will go more into that. I suppose Navina Naqvi's work might tackle some of the questions you're asking, but thank you for those questions.
Thank you so much. And of course, as you rightly say, Islamicate is not the same as Islam.
It's not the same, yeah.
Islamicate just implies that there's an influence of Islam, but that it is a religious and multicultural.
And as it turns out, I think all the texts that I showed you today, none of them were written by people identifying as Muslim, I think. The Khalsa Sharifa officials, the Basant Roy, Warren Hastings.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So I have a hand. I think the first one came from Manik Bourgeois, if I'm not mistaken, and then I have Natalie Rothman after that.
I think it was Natalie was first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you then. Natalie Rothman, please unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this fascinating talk. I'm really taken by the examples that you've offered us of how the British imperial project in Bengal was beholden not only to earlier infrastructures and agents of empire like the Persianate Mughal, but also to contemporaneous ones. You've mentioned the Ottoman, which is an example I'm a bit more familiar with, and the French. And I would add to that, of course, also the Tamil. And here I'm thinking very much of our colleague Bhavani Raman's work on the Kucheri. I think it's a very appropriate connection that we're seeing there. And so these connections that are also contemporaneous to me really raise the question of translation and mediation. And I'm curious, what's your take on this? There's been, earlier interventions by Kapil Raj, and who's doing the actual work of making Persianate worlds available to these British officials. And more recently, as you've mentioned, Rajiv Kinra. And I'm thinking particularly of Rajiv's point that it's not just concepts that are traveling across time and linguistic registers, but really philological techniques and kind of wholesale ideas on and life world. So I'm curious how you see this connection playing out in the examples that you've given us, particularly given how vast these imperial domains are. The example of the Ottoman millet is fascinating because this understanding of millet, of course, is very contemporaneous. It's not the historical understanding of millet that they're importing, but specifically kind of almost Tanzimat era understanding of ethno-linguistic belonging. So I'm very, very interested in how you're thinking of this question of who's doing the mediation and what's the relationship to Persianate understandings of the relationship between language and governance. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for those big questions there. I think we're beginning to learn more from work by scholars like Rishad Chowdhury about the Hajj to Ottoman territory. We're beginning to learn more about those trans-regional connections with Ottoman life. Also work that Andrew Sartori and more recently Du Fei has been doing on the role of Ottoman jurisprudential texts traveling to India. And that raises the question, I think, of jurisprudence, which I didn't really get into, of Arabic writings and the role of Mulvis, what the British would have called Mulvis, which I think was extremely important, and we haven't really, I haven't really got at yet, partly because I don't read Arabic. So I think that's a big question. I also think that the translation point is critical, and it's a little bit of a black hole in historical research at the moment, because fascinatingly and strangely, the translation offices, there were huge numbers of employees in these offices, but there's never been a study of them. I think there could be. It's odd, one of the odd things is in the company, the company, as you know, was the East India Company was just this massive bureaucracy, and it had proceedings for everything: military proceedings, commercial proceedings, public proceedings. But there wasn't translation the translation project, which was there in everything, slightly goes under the radar in the records. So figuring out actually who is doing the translation, those things, it's going to be a challenge, and really a worthwhile one. So that's not a very good answer to your question, but it's just to say that I think it's a really important question, and I haven't got very far with it. The other thing I would say is that having finished the book, I began to think about how, why it was that the Persianate infrastructure of the colonial state was so buried in the historiography. And I think partly it was because of the kind of fiction of translation, that adalat meant law court. It simply did. And so the British, partly because, in other words, of the Persianization of English, these adalat became an English word, zamindar became an English word. And so Persian and the Persianate connotations of those terms got lost. So I think some of it is I'm really interested in the kind of Persianization of English as an imperial language. When Lord Macaulay, makes his famous minute to say, well, English can do everything in India, we don't need Persian anymore. The kind of English he's talking about is a very Persianized English by the 1830s, which is also interesting to think about. So thank you for the question. It's a big one.
Thank you. Manik Bourgeois.
Yes. Thank you for your research and presentation. I was thinking about, that I come from the Parsi Zoroastrian community of India. And since even the Parsi community has their laws, textualized and written, and by which the disputes in the community were judged during the British government or British rule, was this creation of the British government altruistic intention of giving equal importance to all communities, or I guess a combination of that and exerting British dominance over the interpretations of these laws to their benefit?
Thank you. I would refer you to, the brilliant study of Parsi law in British India by Mitra Sharafi, which is fantastic. But also, you raise a very interesting question, because for a long time, the kind of, legal pluralism of British India was taken, or in some interpretations, was seen to reflect a kind of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, that these 18th century British Empire builders were not yet the kind of very chauvinistic, racial hierarchizers of the 19th century, of people like Macaulay, and who really had a strong sense of, the supposed inferiority of South Asian cultures. And so for a long time it was written, these 18th century projects were written about in terms of some kind of a reflection of a kind of Enlightenment universalism or something like that. I think the problem with that view is that it really misses out the way the British are exploiting, what we could call Islamic forms of universalism and prefabricated modes of pluralism that exist in places like Late Mughal Bengal, and then, repackaging them as somehow a kind of enlightened product of English rule. So I'm kind of interested in that, in the question of who gets to be a pluralist, who gets to be remembered historically as a source of universalist forms of rule. And I think there seems to be a kind of, Persianate universalism may be the wrong way of looking at this. Manakia's work on adab is very interesting from this point of view, but the altruism question is a big one that I'm slightly dodging, but I am interested in the ways that, the British, presented themselves as enlightened cosmopolitanism. Often what they were doing was exploiting kind of infrastructures of imperial inclusion, if you like, that were already there.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a comment here from Nasiba Baimatova. Thanks for your talk. I'm amazed with your translation of Hastings' expression. She refers to a particular expression, I think damangir budan, means to have a strong and tenacious grasp or to be in control of somebody. This term is used to describe the wrestling process in Tajik too. So,
excellent. Yeah, no, I thought it was an amazing image that I'm going to be hanging onto your skirts. And actually, it's picked up by British cartoonists because they represent Nanda Kumar appearing as a ghost from beyond the grave to haunt Hastings. So there is a way in which this idea of retribution down the line gets picked up in English satires as well of Hastings. And Hastings gloomily says, when he reads that petition for the first time on the council, he says, we can burn it in Calcutta, but it's going to get out, and I know it, and it's going to become public. And so the power of these texts, obviously it's a very asymmetrical power relations in colonial Calcutta. The British, Nanda Kumar is hung because he's not ultimately in power. He's regarded by the British as a subordinate, but these texts have power, and the British know that.
Right. Amazing. Do we have, I could ask so many questions, but do we have anyone from amongst our wonderful listeners who would like to ask a question? Oh, Professor Tawakkoli Taghi, please.
Professor Travers, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation and exploring this connection between Persian and British rule. You mentioned in the response to Professor Rothman's question how translation goes under the radar and becomes buried. And it seems to me that is essential for understanding this Genesis amnesia, because Genesis amnesia is enacted by hiding that process. The individuals who are involved in writing, crafting, thinking, and the movement, which many of our modern scholars think that is from Europe to the rest of the world, it is much, much more complicated. And in a sense, it comes to the core of what we know as modernity. And much of this legal procedural modernity, the kind of cosmopolitanism, it seems to me that India served as a laboratory of modernity for the British, and a lot of things that we are attributing to Europe, to UK, to British, must have been a product of this intense dialogue, interaction, give and take, translation, writing, back and forth in Persian, English, and other languages. And the concept, the term that you showed in that petition, هر ملت موافق آیین آنها, every sect according to their own laws, is an old saying in many of the medieval Persian mirrors for princes, and sort of a kind of multi-confessionalism and tolerance that existed in India because of its multi-confessional structure that was novel for the British, I think.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, and I think one of the things I've been thinking about in relation to the impeachment is that I think the British had to confront in India in a new way the idea that their law was Christian law and a law for Christians, and that really Britain was a very monocultural society. It was obviously dominated by Protestant Christians and had a few Catholic Christians and fewer still Jews and others. And so we always write about, British Indian law as if there was, Hindu law, Muslim law, and then British law, right?
Right.
But I think the sense of the British confronting their own Christianity and the Christianity of their legal norms is something that has tended to kind of go under the radar, and that I'm kind of interested in thinking about, because Rajiv Kinra has written in a very similar way to the way you phrased your question about Sully-Kul as a kind of model for 17th century British observers. Oh, we could have a much more plural culture in Britain too, and we could invite workers from different religious communities if we follow the Mughal model. So there's something interesting there, but there's something also interesting about how confronting India's multi-confessional legal world makes the British confront the limits of their own legal tradition, which is something I'm interested in thinking through.
Precisely. Thank you.
Thank you.
It also reminds me that I think nowadays we have, translation studies as a major scholarly venture, and people are a lot more attuned to the intricacies of the different methods of translation, and
Yeah.
I think up until very recently, translation was viewed very much as a, mechanical thing, where you didn't have to really explain what your sort of aim is and how closely you are actually, staying with your original text. And so it's sort of, even within Orientalist scholarship, it wasn't really that necessary. I think now we're a lot more careful, right? And we really want to explain what dictionaries we're using. And you mentioned Steingass, and some people might also want to add a few more because Steingass is not enough. It's too old-fashioned, so but I find it also really fascinating that in your research you're not able to find anything from the colonial or the project, but this is, for example, a glossary or something. This is how.
I don't want to misrepresent. There were lots of texts, dictionaries being produced, as Professor Tavakoli Taghi has written about. They often drew on earlier dictionaries produced in Persian. So there was an infrastructure growing up. It's just that the whole office of translation, those are quite hard to study, and you can see them there, but they're quite hard to study, and who is doing what, and so I don't want to misrepresent. I don't think it is impossible to study this. It's just that hasn't been the center of my work.
Right. Okay. fine. Okay, yeah, but still
Yeah.
very interesting. Thank you. And we now have another question. I think we can still take this if you're okay with that, Professor Travers. I
Sure.
don't know your name, sorry. Noruzi is your... Please introduce yourself. Tell us your name.
Yes. Hello and thank you. I am Dr. Mohammad Noruzi from University of Liverpool. Thank you for your speech. I have a question. Did you work on Allame Muhammad Iqbal, who is a great Persian poet that Nicholson translates his poets, The Secrets of the Self, from Persian to English, and it was some part of my PhD thesis about decolonialization and the interaction between Iqbal and Ali Shariati and British decolonial. Did you work
What period was the translation made? Can I just ask?
The Secrets of the Self?
And what year?
Nicholson.
What year? Yeah.
By Nicholson. Nicholson is the
What
same.
period? What period, Mr. Noruzi? What period?
It's 1920. 1920. It was translated.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little out of my range for this work, but I would say that that it seems to me the way in which, to go back to Professor Tavakoli-Targi's question, the way in which India becomes a kind of vector, a kind of point of transmission for Persian literature into English literature is very important, and the way in which the British Indian service generates a kind of Anglo-Persianate milieu, which then acts as a kind of transmission point for Persian poetics and Persian epics and other texts into English is really important and beyond my kind of, purview. But thank you for bringing that up because it's important.
Thank you
so much. I think we've now exhausted you, Professor Travers. Thank you for this amazing presentation. Very, very much appreciated. We're really excited about your research. Look forward to seeing your next publications and to engaging with you further on this fantastic.
Thank you. And let me just thank you very, very much for hosting this and for listening. And if anybody has ideas about that text that I showed, please email. Very gratefully received.
Thank you.
Thank
of course. I think, Bilal, if you have the email address, you could put it into maybe into this chat box.
Yeah, you can find it in the history department at Cornell as well.
Exactly. It's probably late. We're going to shut now, but thank you so much. And
thank you.
Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the day or evening for those of us in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Travers, for your fascinating presentation, and we look forward to your new project. And
thank you.
Please come to Toronto and visit us, and we can collaborate, and we have a great group of people here that we can work on the court cases.
Very much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a lovely day.
Thank
you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.